My name is Nicholas Hartley, and this is a story about silence. Silence not as the simple absence of sound, but as a presence, a force, a kind of intangible companion that reshapes you from the inside out. It happened 10 years ago, during a period when the world around me felt unbearably loud, not only with actual noise, but with a kind of mental clutter that seemed to drown out everything that mattered. At the time, I lived in a fast-paced city and worked as a journalist for an international newspaper. My life was an endless cycle of deadlines, late-night assignments, and constant pressure to stay ahead of the story. People expected quick answers, instant reactions, and perfect clarity at all hours. I woke up to a barrage of emails, spent my days chasing narratives that rarely held meaning for longer than 24 hours, and fell asleep with the sound of sirens, traffic, and my own thoughts echoing in the back of my mind. I felt as though my life had collapsed into noise, external noise, and the internal noise I had never bothered to acknowledge. One winter morning, after several weeks of working without rest, something inside me simply gave way. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like the quiet snap of ice breaking on a frozen lake. My thoughts slowed. My body felt heavy, as though I had been carrying an invisible weight for years. Even the simplest tasks, answering a message, boiling water, tying my shoes, felt overwhelming. Looking back now, I realize it was exhaustion mixed with a kind of emotional disintegration that I hadn't wanted to admit. If I had recognized the signs earlier, I would have stepped back long before I reached that point. But when you are caught up in the chaos, you don't always see the damage being done. That morning, I walked into my editor's office, fully expecting him to dismiss me for being weak. Instead, he raised an eyebrow and quietly granted me a week off. Even now, I sometimes think that if he had refused, I might have pushed through until something inside me broke completely. I might have kept drowning in work until I no longer recognized myself. Without thinking too much, I packed a bag and boarded a train to a remote mountain village I had never visited. I chose it simply because it was far away from everything familiar, far enough to break away from the world I had allowed to swallow me. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the air. It was sharp, clean, almost primordial, as if it belonged to another century. There were no cars, no frantic voices, no neon signs screaming for attention. Only tall trees swaying gently, the low murmur of wind moving through branches, and the distant, steady sound of water flowing over rocks. I rented a small wooden cabin at the edge of a dense forest. The owner, an elderly woman with soft eyes and a voice that sounded like she hadn't rushed a sentence in decades, handed me the key and said, "Rest as long as you need." It was such a simple sentence, yet it felt like permission to breathe for the first time in years. That evening, I built a fire and sat in front of the window. Outside, the world was covered in snow that reflected the faint blue light of the winter sky. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I heard nothing. No messages buzzing, no alarms shouting, no human voices filling the air. Just silence, thick and steady, settling around me like a soft blanket. At first, the quiet felt uncomfortable, almost frightening. I realized how dependent I had become on noise to distract me from myself. But slowly, something inside began to shift. The silence became softer, then warmer, then somehow familiar. It carved out a space in my mind that I had forgotten existed. On the second day, I wandered into the forest. Snow fell gently from the branches, landing on my coat like tiny bursts of cold light. My footsteps created a soft, crunching rhythm on the ground. I felt as though I were walking inside a painting, still, calm, untouched by the frantic world I had left behind. After an hour, I reached a frozen lake. Its surface was white and smooth, like glass covered with a thin layer of clouds. I stood there for a long time, letting the cold air fill my lungs. And then, without warning, tears slid down my face. Not from sadness, from release. It was as though the silence had reached into a part of me I had shut down years earlier and opened a door I hadn't realized I'd locked. If someone had told me years before that silence could be cathartic, I would have laughed. But if I had understood that earlier, I might have saved myself from years of burnout. For the rest of the week, I drifted into a routine that felt both ancient and restorative. I woke with the sun. I wandered through the woods. I cooked simple meals. I read books I had carried for years but had been too preoccupied to open. My thoughts became clearer, less disordered. For the rest of the week, I drifted into a routine that felt both ancient and restorative. I woke with the sun. I wandered through the woods. I cooked simple meals. I read books I had carried for years but had been too preoccupied to open. My thoughts became clearer, less disordered. My breathing slowed. My body gradually reclaimed its strength, as though silence itself had been stitching me back together. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. I met an old man by the lake. He was fishing, although the water was nearly frozen solid. He greeted me with a gentle smile and said, "Sometimes it isn't the fish we come here for. Sometimes it's the silence." We talked for nearly 2 hours, though it felt like half that time. He told me stories about his life, his joys, his regrets, the people he had lost. What struck me most wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. His voice had a steadiness that made me feel as if everything he said mattered, even the small details. Before I left, he looked at me and said, "The world is loud because people are afraid of silence. Silence forces us to face ourselves, but once you learn to listen to it, silence becomes a friend." If I hadn't met him, I might never have understood what silence could teach me. When the week ended, I packed my bag and walked to the train station. The air felt lighter, and so did I. It was as though the silence had polished my thoughts the way a river smooths a stone. The world had become quiet, not because the noise had disappeared, but because I had finally learned how to listen beneath it. When I returned to the city, the noise was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I could hold on to the quiet I had found, like a small flame that refused to go out. I continued my work as a journalist, but everything felt different. I listened more carefully. I noticed the nuances in people's stories. I heard the emotions hiding between their words. Silence taught me something no book or mentor ever had. It taught me to understand myself, and the world, with a deeper clarity. And every time life becomes too loud again, I return, in my mind, to that lake, to that man, to that week when the world finally became quiet.